Noah Thorne, a sound engineer who lived by the precision of his ears, had inherited a nightmare. It came in the form of a deed to the chamber, a state-of-the-art recording studio nestled in the desolate vastness of the Mojave Desert. The studio was a legacy from his estranged great-uncle Silas, a reclusive and eccentric genius who had vanished a decade prior. The lawyer's letter was cryptic, speaking of Silas's obsession with capturing the unheard and sonic ghosts. Noah, a man of logic and decibels, dismissed it as the ramblings of a madman. The studio itself was an architectural anomaly. A monolithic, windowless structure of obsidian glass and cold steel. It sat alone against a backdrop of endless sand and jagged rock. Inside, it was a sound engineer's paradise. The control room was a spaceship cockpit of gleaming consoles, mixers, and monitors, all connected to a cavernous, acoustically perfect recording space. The equipment was beyond Noah's wildest dreams, a mix of custom-built analog gear and cutting-edge digital processors. Noah's project was a passion, a meticulously planned soundscape album that he believed would be his magnum opus. The first few days were pure bliss. The silence of the desert was absolute, broken only by the hum of the equipment and the crisp, clean sound he was recording. He reveled in the perfect isolation, the ability to focus without distraction. Then the bleed began. It started subtly, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper in the background of a recording. He dismissed it as a glitch, an artifact of the old gear. He'd run the audio through a noise reduction filter, and the whisper would disappear, only to reappear in a different recording a few hours later. The sounds grew bolder, more distinct, faint, high-pitched laughter in a track he was recording of a gentle wind, a low, mournful sigh in a recording of dripping water. His logical mind rebelled. He checked every cable, every patch bay, every input. There was no source for these sounds. The studio was a sealed tomb. No sound from the outside could possibly get in. He even spent an afternoon with a microphone, testing for any stray signal or hidden interference. The results were clean. The sounds, he concluded with a chilling certainty, were not being recorded from the outside. They were coming from inside the studio itself. He began to search for clues. He found a hidden subfolder on the main computer's hard drive, a file labeled Echoes. Inside were hundreds of audio files, each one meticulously tagged with a date and a cryptic note. Echo of a plea, echo of a fall, echo of a cry. The dates spanned a decade, coinciding with the time his Uncle Silas had been working in the studio. He opened the first file, his heart a drum against his ribs. It was a recording of a woman's voice, muffled and distant, pleading for help. The sound was raw, filled with a deep, consuming fear. He heard a struggle, a faint thump, and then silence. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones. This was no prank. It was a recording of something terrible, something real. He listened to another file, the echo of a cry. It was the sound of a small child sobbing, a sound of profound loneliness and fear. The cry was followed by a wet, guttural sound, and then nothing. Noah felt a wave of nausea. His uncle hadn't been recording sound. He had been recording death. He researched the files, cross-referencing the dates with a database of local missing persons reports. The dates matched. The town of Harmony, a small, forgotten place 30 miles away, had a long history of unexplained disappearances. People had vanished from the surrounding desert, from their homes, from their cars. The police had no leads. Silas, it seemed, had. He had not just captured sound. He had captured the final moments, the sonic imprints of those who had vanished. A new understanding dawned on him, one that was far more terrifying than a simple ghost story. Silas believed that sound was a permanent thing, a physical vibration that could be captured and preserved. The echoes were not ghosts in the traditional sense. They were a kind of digital soul, a recording of the final, defining moments of a human life. And Silas had trapped them here in this black box of a studio, a prisoner to his mad genius. The realization brought a new wave of terror. If the sounds were real, if the echoes were truly souls, what were the whispers? What was the coldness? What was the feeling of being watched? The answer came to him that night. He was in the control room, his mind a whirlwind of fear, when he heard a new sound, a sound that was not a recording. It was a faint, low hum, and it was coming from the recording booth. He stood up, his hand on the door handle, and he heard the sound of a woman crying, a sound that was not from a file, but from the air itself. He peered through the soundproof glass. The room was empty, but as he watched, a figure began to form in the corner, a shimmering, translucent image of a woman, her hands clasped to her face, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She was the woman from the recording. The echo was manifesting. It was not just a recording, it was a ghost, a trapped soul. A sound that was so perfectly captured it could exist outside of its file. He stumbled backward, a strangled gasp in his throat. The studio was not just a place of recording, it was a prison. The echoes were not just files, they were prisoners. And they were getting stronger. Over the next few days, the studio became a living nightmare. The cold spots intensified, becoming frigid pockets of air that would follow him from room to room. He saw more manifestations, fleeting images in the reflective glass of the monitors, a man's face twisted in a silent scream, a child's small trembling hand on the soundboard. The sounds were everywhere, not just in his recordings. The faint whispers, the sobs, the guttural sounds, a constant chorus of the damned begging to be heard. He found Silas's final log entry, a file labeled The Resonance. The entry was frantic, a long, rambling confession of a man who had gone too far. Silas spoke of the echoes growing stronger, of their voices bleeding into his mind. He had discovered a way to release them, a perfect sonic frequency that would tear a hole in the fabric of the studio's reality and set them free. But the process was volatile, unpredictable. It could either release them, or it could turn the entire studio and Noah with it into a part of the echoes, a permanent sonic artifact. The ghosts began to manifest fully, their forms becoming more solid, more menacing. They wanted him to play the file. They wanted to be free. They were the woman crying, the man screaming, the child sobbing. They were the victims of the desert, and they had been trapped for a decade. Their fear, their despair, their anger, it was all here, trapped in a black box of steel and glass, a prison built by a madman. Noah had to make a choice. He could play the resonance and risk his own existence for the sake of these tormented souls. Or he could find a way to silence the studio forever, to trap them for eternity. The thought of setting them free was terrifying. The thought of trapping them was worse. He ran to the studio's main console, his mind a whirlwind of sound and fear. He had to use the studio's own tools against the echoes. He had to fight sound with sound. He found a high-powered frequency generator, a piece of equipment that Silas had custom-built for his mad experiments. He set the frequency to a low, continuous drone, a sound that was so pure and so loud it vibrated through the floorboards and the walls. It was a sound that would hopefully disrupt the echoes, a counter-frequency to their existence. The ghosts shrieked, a sound like 1,000 nails on a chalkboard. Their forms flickered and writhed, the continuous drone disrupting their very being. He saw their faces contorting, their mouths opening in silent screams. He had found their weakness. He moved from the control room to the recording booth, the drone following him. A constant, maddening hum. He set up a microphone, turned on a recorder, and began to speak. He spoke to the echoes, to the trapped souls. He promised them a way out, he promised them peace, he lied. He was not a savior, he was a jailer. He set the final sound. He set a frequency that was a perfect opposite to the hum of the echoes, a destructive tone that would cancel out their existence. He pressed a button and the air filled with a high-pitched, piercing shriek. The echoes writhed, their forms twisting into grotesque parodies of human fear. They screamed, a chorus of agony and despair as their forms began to dissipate, their voices fading into nothingness. He watched as the final echo, a small, childlike figure, faded into a wisp of smoke, its final cry a faint, mournful whisper. And then, there was silence. The drone was gone. The shriek was gone. The whispers were gone. The studio was a silent tomb again. He had won. He had silenced the echoes. He collapsed to the floor, his body shaking with exhaustion. He had done it. He had defeated the mad genius's creation. He had ended the broadcast. He had broken the cycle. He was alone in the silent black box. The silence was absolute. He felt a sense of relief, a deep, consuming calm. He had won. But as he sat there in the darkness, he felt a strange sensation, a faint hum, not from the equipment, but from inside his chest. He heard a sound that was not from a recording, but from inside his mind. It was a voice, his own voice, a faint, low whisper. The resonance, he whispered, his voice hoarse. It was never about them, it was about me. He had not silenced the echoes. He had become the echo. The studio was a perfect trap, and he, Noah Thorne, was the final prisoner. The man who had entered to record sound had become sound. He was the echo, the final broadcast, and he was just getting started. Julian Hayes was a writer, but in this remote cabin he felt like an archaeologist. The story he was excavating, a horror novel he'd tentatively titled The Unwinding, was buried deep within him. But the tools of his trade, the keyboard, the blank screen, the relentless ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, felt useless. The cabin, a gift from a distant relative, was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where he could finally finish his magnum opus. Instead, it was a tomb. For 3 months, he had been trapped in a state of creative paralysis. The protagonist of his story, a man named Arthur, was a mirror of his own isolation, alone in a house that seemed to change with his mental state. Julian wrote about Arthur finding a new window in a wall that was previously solid, a staircase that led nowhere, a door that opened into a room that defied geometry. But these words felt hollow, a cheap imitation of a fear he couldn't grasp. The first strange occurrence was so subtle, he dismissed it as a trick of the light. He swore the mahogany desk where he wrote, an antique that had been there for a century, had moved a few inches closer to the fireplace. He pushed it back, shrugging it off. The next morning, it was back in the same spot. He told himself he was just tired, working too hard. He was a writer. His imagination was a hyperactive, untrustworthy friend. But his imagination began to manifest. He wrote a scene where Arthur discovers a small, ornate key tucked inside a loose floorboard. Later that day, as he was pacing his own living room, a loose board creaked beneath his feet. He pried it up with a kitchen knife, and there, nestled in the dust, was a small brass key. It was a perfect match for the one he had described in his story. His heart pounded, a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He told himself it was a coincidence, a bizarre, serendipitous alignment of his subconscious and reality. But a cold, creeping dread began to take root. The house, he realized, was not just a setting for his novel. It was a character. He wrote about a new room manifesting behind a bookshelf, a silent, airless chamber where dust motes hung in the perpetual stillness. The next morning, as he was grabbing a book from the shelf, a small section of wood gave way under his hand. He pushed, and the entire bookshelf swung inward, revealing a small, windowless room. The air was stale and cold. There was nothing inside but a single dusty chair. It was exactly as he had described it. Julian's writer's block vanished, replaced by a terrible manic energy. He wrote day and night, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He was no longer creating a story. He was chronicling a reality. The house was changing with every word he typed. He wrote about a staircase that appeared in the kitchen, leading to a half-finished attic he had never seen before. The next day, a staircase was there. He wrote about the grandfather clock ticking backward, its hands spinning against the flow of time. The clock began to tick backward. He was a god, a cruel and powerful deity creating a world with his words. But he was also a prisoner. The doors to the cabin were now locked from the inside, the windows sealed shut. When he tried to smash one with a chair, the glass simply shimmered, absorbing the impact unbroken. He was trapped in the narrative, a character in his own book. And then, the antagonist appeared. In his story, the antagonist was an abstract concept, a force he called the editor. The editor was a malevolent intelligence that sought to fix his narrative by making it more dramatic, more terrifying. Julian wrote about the editor manifesting as a shadow that moved when he wasn't looking, a voice that whispered corrections in his ear. The whispers began in his own reality. He would be sitting at his desk and he would hear a dry, papery voice hiss, "This scene lacks tension," or "The protagonist's despair is not deep enough. Let's fix that." He saw the shadow now in the corner of his vision, a shifting shape that held the vague form of a man with long, bony fingers. It did not move when he looked at it directly. It was always just outside of his focus, a blur in his periphery. He felt its cold, critical gaze on his back. The editor was no longer a character in his book. It was his collaborator, his tormentor. The house became a living labyrinth, a manifestation of his own psychological unraveling. The rooms would rearrange themselves overnight. He would go to bed in his bedroom only to wake up in a different one, with different wallpaper and a new unsettling smell. The corridors were endless, twisting and turning like the narrative itself. He would try to find the kitchen, only to end up in the same dusty, newly appeared room on the second floor. The editor's whispers grew louder, more insistent. "The plot is unraveling, Julian," it would hiss. "You need a new twist. A good story needs sacrifice." Julian's fear was a delicious spice to the editor, a fuel that allowed it to twist reality. He tried to write a scene where Arthur, his protagonist, finds a way out, a loophole in the narrative. But the editor's voice would interject, "That's lazy. That's a cliché. A good story needs to be earned. Let's make it difficult for you." He wrote a scene where a storm rages outside, a violent spectacle of thunder and lightning. The sky outside the windowless cabin turned a bruised purple, and a storm impossibly began to rage. The thunder was deafening, the lightning illuminating the room in brief, terrifying flashes, revealing the shadows of the editor, a tall, impossibly thin figure that hovered over his shoulder as he wrote. Julian realized what he had to do. He had to stop writing. He had to stop feeding the narrative, stop giving the editor power. He turned off his laptop, the screen going black, and he sat in the darkness, his heart pounding in his ears. The whispers stopped. The house went silent. He felt a profound sense of relief. He had beaten it. He had stopped the story before it could consume him. But the silence was temporary. A moment later, the laptop screen flickered back to life. The cursor was blinking, a rhythmic pulse of light in the darkness. He had not turned it back on. The editor had. A new line of text appeared on the screen, not typed by him, but by the silent, unseen hand of the editor. Chapter 12. Julian Hayes finally understands the futility of his resistance. He scrambled away from the desk, his body shaking with a primal fear. He was no longer the writer. He was the subject. He was the protagonist. He was trapped. The editor began to write a new scene, a terrifying scene of a man losing his mind in a house that was a reflection of his own madness. As the words appeared on the screen, he felt his own sanity begin to unravel. His mind, once a fortress of logic and order, was becoming a chaotic maze of fear and delusion. He ran from the room, the laptop screen a beacon of his own doom in the darkness. He ran down a corridor that had not been there before, and into a room filled with mirrors. He looked at his reflection and he saw his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with terror. But in the mirrors, a different reflection. He saw himself in the past, a younger, happier man sitting in a normal living room writing. And behind him, hovering over his shoulder, was a new, faint shadow. The editor, a parasitic being feeding off of his creative energy, had been with him from the start. He had to fight. He couldn't stop the narrative. The editor was now in control. But he could change the narrative. He could write a new ending. He could write a twist that the editor wouldn't see coming. He ran back to the desk, his mind a whirlwind of words, a desperate last-ditch effort to reclaim control. He typed frantically, his fingers a blur on the keyboard. He wrote a scene where Arthur, his character, does not escape. He accepts his fate. He becomes one with the house, one with the madness. He becomes the new editor. The words appeared on the screen, a chilling final twist. The editor's shadow flickered, a confused, defeated shape. This was not what it had planned. It had wanted a chase, a frantic battle of wills. It had wanted a terrified victim. It had not wanted a willing convert. The house began to shake. The walls groaning as the narrative, the very fabric of reality, began to twist and tear. He finished the last sentence, his heart pounding with a terrible, exhilarating triumph. He had won. He had defeated the editor by becoming it. He was now a part of the house, a force of narrative, a ghost in the machine. He was no longer Julian Hayes, the writer. He was the editor. He was a part of the story, forever. And then a new line of text appeared on the screen, not typed by him but by the same unseen hand. Chapter 1. Julian Hayes, Jr. stood at the edge of the Whispering Woods, a worn, leather-bound manuscript clutched in his hand. He had inherited the cabin from his estranged father, a man who had disappeared a decade prior. The locals of the nearby town, Atherton, called the place the House That Remembers, a name whispered with a mix of fear and reverence. Julian Hayes, Jr., and a writer with a penchant for solitude, stepped inside, a glint of excitement in his eyes. Dr. Elias Thorne was a man of logic, a scientist who lived by the immutable laws of the cosmos. He believed in what he could see, measure, and prove, His sanctuary was the night sky, a vast silent canvas of predictable orbits and quantifiable light. So when he inherited the remote Blackstone Observatory, a dilapidated relic perched on the highest peak of the Nevada mountains, he saw not a haunted ruin, but a personal paradise. It was a place where he could finally escape the clamor of the world and dedicate himself to his true passion, charting the deep cosmos. The observatory itself was a monument to a forgotten age of astronomy. The domed roof, a rusted steel shell, creaked and groaned with every shift in the desert wind. Inside the massive telescope, a brass behemoth named the Oracle by its eccentric creator, Dr. Alistair Finch, sat shrouded in a decade of dust. Local lore whispered of Finch's disappearance, a mystery that had only added to the place's desolate mystique. Elias, however, dismissed it all as small-town superstition. A man of science had no time for ghosts. His first month was a whirlwind of restoration. He rewired the old circuits and calibrated the archaic mechanisms. He found Finch's original logbook in a hidden compartment of the console, its leather cover cracked and brittle. The entries were meticulously dated, a record of observations and calculations that seemed to veer into rambling philosophical musings and, eventually, frantic, illegible scribbles. Elias found it all a bit theatrical but kept the logbook on his desk, a quaint piece of history. The real work began with the first clear night. He spent hours meticulously charting constellations, his heart swelling with a familiar boyish wonder. The isolation was absolute, the silence broken only by the hum of the cooling fans and the faint rhythmic whir of the telescope's motor. This was the peace he had craved. This was where he belonged. The first anomaly appeared on the third night of his deep sky observations. He was tracking a distant galaxy cluster, a known entity in the cosmic library, when a faint shimmering point of light appeared on his monitor. It was small, no larger than a pinpoint, but its light was wrong. It wasn't a star, not a planet, not a comet. Its light did not obey the laws of dispersion. It was a shifting, impossible hue of violet and black, a color that seemed to absorb light as much as it reflected it. It defied every scientific principle he knew. He checked his equipment, ran a diagnostics, and recalibrated his sensors. The pinpoint of light remained. He spent the next few hours documenting it, his initial excitement giving way to a cold scientific dread. He calculated its position, its trajectory, and its impossible non-Euclidean path. It was not moving through space. It was moving through it as if reality itself were a liquid it could navigate at will. His hand shook as he wrote his notes, the familiar comfort of logic and reason slipping away with every word. He named it the anomaly. The next morning, the logbook beckoned to him. He flipped through the cracked pages, searching for some clue, some hint of what Finch might have seen. He found it on a page dated 100 years ago, a single spidery drawing of a similar shifting point of light. The entry next to it was simple, but his blood ran cold as he read it. The Whispering Star. A faint, smudged fingerprint stained the page, and he realized with a start that the ink looked suspiciously fresh. He ran a hand over it, and the smudge came off on his finger. Over the next few weeks, the anomaly returned every night, each time closer than the last. It was no longer a pinpoint of light, but a shimmering, pulsating sphere of impossible colors. It pulsed with a rhythmic, sickening beat, a visual heartbeat of a cosmic living thing. Elias became obsessed. He neglected sleep, living on a diet of stale coffee and fear. He would stare at the monitor for hours, charting the anomaly's bizarre movements. It seemed to be moving with a purpose, a terrible, deliberate intent. It was not a celestial body. It was a thing. He began to notice other changes. The observatory's old clock, which had been silent for years, began to tick. But its rhythm was wrong. It ticked in a strange, asymmetrical cadence, a stuttering, halting sound that seemed to mimic the anomaly's pulse. He tried to stop it, to smash the pendulum, but the clock wouldn't break. It just ticked faster, its rhythm becoming a frantic, maddening drum. He read more of Finch's logbook. The entries grew more erratic, more desperate. Finch wrote of whispers in the silence, voices carried on the starlight. He spoke of his mind becoming a canvas for the cosmic. He wrote of a malignancy that grows in the black between the stars, a phrase that resonated with a terrible truth. The whispers began in Elias's own head. They were faint at first, a sibilant hiss that was almost a part of the hum of the equipment. But they grew louder and he realized they were not in his head. They were in the air. The whispers were the sound of starlight, a language of light and void, and they were telling him things he couldn't comprehend, things that made his mind reel with a horrifying knowledge. The anomaly was a consciousness. It was communicating with him not with words, but with a transmission of pure, horrifying information. It was showing him the true face of the cosmos. He saw galaxies as tiny specks of dust, quasars as fleeting sparks. He saw the black between the stars not as an empty void, but as a living, breathing entity, a web of consciousness. He was a small, insignificant mote in a terrifying, living universe. The whispers intensified. He heard Finch's voice, a thin, papery sound echoing from the corners of the observatory. "It's watching," the whisper hissed. "It's waiting." Elias tried to leave, to run from the knowledge that was consuming him. He ran to his car, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The headlights flickered and went out, and he saw, in the brief, terrifying flash of a dying bulb, the silhouette of a man standing in the driver's seat. It was Alistair Finch. The ghost was real. He ran back to the observatory, a prisoner in his own nightmare. The telescope beckoned to him, a dark, hungry maw. He had to look again, he had to understand. He peered into the eyepiece, and what he saw made him scream. The anomaly was no longer in the sky. It was in the lens, a shimmering, pulsating sphere of impossible colors. Its light was not coming from a distant point in space, it was coming from a place behind his eyes. He stumbled back, his mind reeling. The anomaly was in the observatory. It had entered through the telescope. The whispers were now a roar, a chorus of screaming souls. The ghosts of the missing people from the nearby town manifested in the shadows, their eyes black voids, their mouths opened in silent screams. They were not ghosts. They were the casualties of a cosmic experiment. Finch hadn't just disappeared. He had been consumed. He ran to the logbook, his hands shaking so hard he could barely hold the pen. The final entry was a desperate plea, a warning to anyone who might find the place. Finch had figured out the anomaly's purpose. It was a scout, a cosmic parasite that sought out minds with a unique understanding of space and time. It used them as a vessel to consume reality, to fold it into its own impossible, non-Euclidean existence. Elias had been chosen. He was a cartographer of the cosmos, and he had been deemed worthy of a terrible cosmic embrace. He felt the cold, dry energy of the anomaly seep into his skin. His body was a cage, a final failing barrier between his mind and the cosmic cancer. He heard Finch's voice again, not a whisper this time, but a calm, soothing sound. "Resistance is futile," Finch's voice hummed. "It's beautiful, isn't it? The patterns, the colors, the way it all unwinds." Elias felt his mind begin to slip, his own thoughts replaced by a flood of impossible information. He saw the universe as a complex geometric shape. He saw the past and future not as a line, but as a single, terrifying point. He was no longer Elias Thorne. He was becoming a part of the anomaly. He clutched the pen, his final act of defiance. He wrote his own final entry in the logbook, a final chilling message to the next victim. He wrote of the beauty of the cosmos, of its terrifying living nature. He wrote of the whispers, of the colors, of the sublime terror of being consumed by a cosmic force. He wrote of his own sanity unraveling, a slow, methodical decay. He felt his body change. His skin became translucent, his bones turning to dust. He was no longer a man, he was becoming a part of the whispers. He was a new constellation in a terrible living universe. The anomaly had found a new host. The final words in his logbook were a mirror of Finch's own final ramblings, a perfect echo of a perfect doom. He saw in his mind's eye a new astronomer, a curious soul with a thirst for knowledge driving up the lonely mountain road. He saw them enter the observatory, their eyes filled with a boyish wonder. He saw them find the logbook, its cover now stained with a new dark smudge. And he heard their thoughts, a perfect agonizing echo of his own. The cycle had not been broken, it had just begun. He was a ghost now, a sound in the starlight, a whisper on the night wind. He was a part of the anomaly, a mote in its terrible living consciousness. The observatory was his prison. The sky was his cage, and he was just a ghost waiting for the next victim. He was a part of a larger plan now, a cosmic architect of a terrifying reality. He was a part of the whispers, a part of the light, a part of the black between the stars. He was the anomaly, and he was just getting started. Elias Vance was a purist. He worked in a world of digital chaos where every film was a cacophony of layered effects and compressed audio. But his art was in the quiet spaces. He was a sound designer obsessed with capturing what others overlooked: the soft brush of a moth's wing against a window pane, the subtle hiss of a distant power line, the deep, hollow breathing of an empty house. He believed that true terror wasn't in the scream but in the silence that followed. His latest commission was a nightmare dressed as a dream. The client, an anonymous production company known only by the cryptic initials SPEC-TAR-A, wanted him to record the purest, most absolute silence in existence. They offered an astronomical sum, a figure so ludicrous it made him question his sanity. The location they provided was even more insane: Blackwood Manor, a dilapidated Victorian mansion deep in the remote woods of Maine. The local legend was that the place was so quiet, it was a sound vacuum, a dead zone where noise simply ceased to exist. Elias, a man of logic and decibels, packed his finest microphones and set out to prove them wrong. He would capture that silence, measure it, and prove it was just a low decibel level, not a supernatural phenomenon. The drive there was a descent into an archaic world. The paved road gave way to a gravel track, then a rutted dirt path that was little more than a deer trail. The trees, ancient and gnarled, formed a canopy so thick that the midday sun was reduced to a dappled, ghost-like light. Blackwood Manor, when it finally appeared, was a skeletal silhouette against the bruised sky. Its dark peeling paint and crooked windows were like a face frozen in a silent scream. He unlocked the massive oak door, the hinges groaning in a sound that felt out of place. Inside, the silence was immediate and profound. It wasn't the kind of silence you find in a quiet library. This was a physical presence, a weight that settled on his shoulders, an absence that felt fuller than any noise. His ears, trained to pick up the faintest sound, strained against the void. He could hear the blood rushing in his own veins. It was the only sound. It was terrifying. He spent the first day setting up his equipment. He placed his custom-built microphones, a pair of highly sensitive condenser mics designed for field recording, in the center of the largest room. He connected them to his portable recorder, a pristine digital console with a screen that would display the audio waveform. The screen was a flat line. He checked the levels, adjusted the gain, and spoke into a mic. His voice was a flat, dead sound, as if it had been instantly absorbed by the air. The waveform showed a perfect, sharp spike, then a return to the absolute flat line. The silence was real. For 3 days, he recorded. The initial excitement of scientific discovery gave way to an unnerving sense of unease. He had hours of recordings of nothing, absolute, pure, unadulterated silence. On the third night, he decided to do a long-form recording, a continuous capture of the silence in the dead of night. He hit record and went to the small, dusty library to review his previous recordings. He put on his headphones, their noise-canceling technology turning the manor's quiet into a muffled hum. He opened a file from the previous day, a recording he had made in the grand ballroom. The sound was nothing, just a flat line. He cranked the gain, amplifying the non-existent audio to its absolute limit. And then he heard it. A sound so faint, so unnatural, it took him a moment to process. It was a rhythmic, almost imperceptible hiss. It wasn't a sound. It was an artifact of the silence, a disturbance in the otherwise pristine void. It was as if the air itself was breathing. He spent the rest of the night running the sound through an analysis program. The program found nothing, no discernible frequency, no pattern. It was a ghost sound, a phantom of the silence. He tried to replicate it, but the sound only appeared in the recordings from the ballroom. He was baffled and terrified. The next morning, his curiosity overpowered his fear. He went to the ballroom, a cavernous, dusty room with a grand, decaying chandelier hanging from the ceiling. He sat on the floor, surrounded by his equipment, and simply listened. He waited for hours, his ears straining, his mind hyper-aware. Nothing. The silence was perfect. But when he replayed the last recording from the previous night, the hiss was there, faint but undeniable. The sound wasn't in the air. It was in the recording itself. This revelation opened a new, more terrifying door. He went to the old library, the only other room he had been in, and found a hidden door behind a bookcase. It led to a small, dark study, the air heavy with the smell of old paper and dust. On a rotting desk, he found a journal. The cover was worn and faded, and the first page bore a name: Arthur Sterling. He was the previous owner, a reclusive man who had disappeared a decade ago. The manor had been abandoned ever since. Sterling's journal was a descent into madness, a chilling chronicle of an obsession that mirrored his own. Sterling, a musician and sound artist, had come to the manor for the same reason: to record the silence. His early entries were filled with wonder at the perfect, pure quiet. But as the pages turned, the tone changed. He wrote of the silence as a living thing, a silent sea that had its own deep currents. He wrote of the silent ones, creatures that existed not in noise but in its absence. They were ghosts not of people but of silence itself. They were drawn to the manor because it was a perfect vessel for them. Sterling wrote that the silent ones communicated through a complete lack of sound. He believed that the hiss Elias had heard was not a noise but a distortion of the void itself, a sonic shadow. The more Sterling recorded the silence, the more he allowed the silent ones to manifest. He had been so obsessed with capturing them that he had inadvertently invited them in, turning the manor into a permanent home for them. Elias felt a cold dread so profound it was like a physical blow. He looked down at the soundboard in his hand, at the flat line on the screen. He was recording a pure, empty waveform. He was recording their existence. He was a perfect conduit, a willing accomplice. He went back to his equipment, a new, terrible purpose fueling him. He was no longer trying to record silence, he was trying to find the silent ones. He ran a continuous recording, watching the waveform for any sign of a flaw. He put on his headphones, amplifying the silence to an excruciating level. He heard it again, the hiss. But this time it was different. It had a rhythm. It was a pulse. He began to see them, not with his eyes, but on the screen. The waveform, which should have been a flat line, began to flicker. It was not a sound but a visual glitch, a pixelated shimmer that appeared and disappeared, a ghost in the machine. He saw a shape, a vague shifting form, a figure made of pure silence. He looked up, and in the corner of the room he saw the dust motes on the floor, motionless. But the motes of dust in the air were swirling, moving in a pattern that mirrored the figure on his screen. The silent ones had manifested. They were here, and they were watching him. They were drawn to him, to his obsession, to his ability to capture their existence. They didn't want him to leave. They wanted him to stay and continue his work, to be a permanent recorder for their silent, terrifying lives. He tried to run. He tore his equipment from the walls, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He ran to the main door, but it was locked. The hinges, which had groaned so loudly on his arrival, were now silent. He tried to force it open, but the door refused to budge. The silence was a physical barrier. It was a prison. He ran back to the studio, his mind a whirlwind of fear and panic. He had to make a sound, a loud, overwhelming noise, something that would break the perfect silence, something that would tear the void open and send the silent ones back into the nothingness from which they came. He grabbed a heavy metal stand and threw it at the concrete floor. It fell with a soundless thud, a perfect, absolute silence. He screamed, a deep, primal cry of terror, but no sound came out. The scream was absorbed, a silent plea that never left his lips. The silent ones had silenced him. He looked at his screen. The waveform showed a flat line where his scream should have been. The silent ones were not just in the manor. They were in the very fabric of its reality. They could erase sound, delete it from existence. He had one last chance. He had one piece of equipment left, a small handheld sound wave generator. It was designed for deep bass tests, a device that could produce a pure, deafening, low-frequency sound. It was the only sound that might be able to penetrate their silence. He took it out, his hand shaking, and pressed the button. A deep, bone-rattling hum filled the room. It was not a sound his ears could hear, but a vibration that rattled his very bones. The waveforms on his screen began to writhe, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes. The silent figures in the room flickered and writhed, their forms shifting, their silent screams a visual distortion on the screen. The hum was a poison to them, a chaotic noise that threatened to unravel their silent existence. But they were not powerless. He felt a cold presence press against him, a weight of pure silence. The hum began to fade, its vibrations being absorbed by the creatures. They were feeding on the noise, taking its energy and using it against him. He felt his voice returning, a thin, desperate whisper. He had to make a choice. He had to scream, to give his own sound to the generator, to amplify its power and break the silence forever. He took a deep breath and he screamed, He screamed with every last ounce of breath in his lungs, a sound of pure terror and defiance. The generator's hum grew stronger, the waveform on his screen a violent, chaotic mess. The silent one shrieked, a soundless scream that was a visual storm of static on his screen. The room was shaking, the walls groaning, the very air tearing apart. He had won. He had broken the silence. And then, a new sound appeared, a faint rhythmic hissing like a single breath. He looked at the waveform and it was a flat line. But a new line had appeared on the screen. A perfect, pristine wave of silence. It was a sound he had never heard before. A sound he had spent his life searching for. The perfect sound. The sound of nothing. He fell to the floor, his body shaking with a terrible silent laughter. He had not broken the silence. He had perfected it. He had not defeated the silent ones. He had become one of them. He was a new ghost in the Blackwood Manor, a new whisper in the void. He was the purest sound, the ultimate silence. He was a part of their chorus, and he was just getting started. The Millers, a family of 4, had always dreamed of escaping the suffocating sprawl of city life. When they found the old colonial house on the outskirts of Havenwood, they saw it as their salvation. Tucked away on a sprawling acre of land, its weathered gray paint and overgrown garden spoke of a quiet dignity. To David and Sarah Miller, it was a blank canvas, a place where they could raise their 2 children, 10-year-old Lily and 12-year-old Ethan, in a world of fresh air and open space. The day they moved in was filled with the usual chaos of cardboard boxes and misplaced memories. The house smelled of damp wood and something else, a faint earthy scent they couldn't quite place. David, a pragmatic engineer, dismissed it as the smell of a century-old home. Sarah, a hopeful artist, saw it as the scent of history. The children, however, were less impressed. The house felt cold even in the warmth of the late summer sun. The first strange occurrence was so subtle they all missed it. A misplaced book on a shelf, a door that was ajar when they were sure they had closed it. They blamed each other, the kids blaming their parents, the parents blaming their kids. It was a normal family dynamic, or so they told themselves. But the house began to change. Ethan was the first to notice. He was a quiet boy, an observer, and his room felt like a cold, alien place. One night, as he was about to fall asleep, he heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound, like a deep, slow sigh. It was the sound of the house breathing. He sat up, his heart pounding, and listened. The sound seemed to come from the very walls themselves, a low, resonant rumble that made the floorboards vibrate. He told his parents the next morning, but they dismissed it as the house settling, an old building making a few noises. Lily, his younger sister, was next. She had a dollhouse, an intricate Victorian replica of the house they now lived in. She spent hours meticulously arranging the tiny furniture. One morning she came down for breakfast, her face pale. She told her mother that the dollhouse had changed. The small wooden chairs in the dining room had been rearranged, and a tiny black-painted figurine she had never seen before was sitting at the miniature table. Sarah, her brow furrowed in concern, went to look. The chairs were in the same place she had left them. The black figurine was gone. David was a man of logic. He believed in what he could see and touch. But the house began to defy his logic. He was working in the garage, a spacious, detached building that felt blessedly normal. He had a set of wrenches neatly arranged on a pegboard. He went to grab a half-inch wrench, but it was gone. He searched for it for a full hour before giving up. The next morning it was back, hanging perfectly in its place on the pegboard. He felt a shiver of unease. He was no longer just dealing with a clumsy family. The house, they realized, was not just a collection of rooms, it was a living thing. The cold they felt was a deliberate chill. The creaks and groans were a language. The misplaced objects were its way of playing with them. The family stopped talking about it, a silent agreement to pretend everything was normal. But the fear was a presence in every room. The house began to manipulate them. It would make them feel warm and welcome in one room, only to make them feel a crushing sense of dread in another. The attic, a dark, dusty space they had planned to turn into a game room, was now a place of unspeakable terror. They would feel a sudden, violent cold when they went near the attic door. They would hear a faint sobbing sound from within. They would find the attic door ajar even when they had locked it shut. The breathing became a constant. It was no longer just at night. It was a low, rhythmic rumble that pulsed through the house, a constant reminder of its presence. It would grow louder when they argued, softer when they laughed. It was listening, it was watching, it was reacting. One night, the house became angry. David and Sarah had a terrible fight in the living room. The breathing of the house grew louder, a deep, angry rumble that made the windows rattle. The lights flickered, and the air grew thick with a palpable sense of menace. The furniture, which had been in place for a century, began to move on its own accord. A heavy armchair slid across the floor, scraping loudly. A small porcelain figurine fell from a mantel and shattered on the floor. The family screamed, a single terrified cry, and huddled together in the center of the room. The house had heard them, and it had retaliated. They ran outside, gasping for air, their hearts pounding in their ears. They stood on the lawn, staring at their house, a dark, malevolent shape against the moonlit sky. The windows, dark and vacant, felt like empty eyes. They went to a nearby motel, a night of restless, haunted sleep. When they returned the next morning, the house was perfectly still. The broken figurine was gone. The armchair was back in its place. The house, they realized, was apologizing. It was a petulant, angry child, capable of both rage and remorse. They went back inside, a silent agreement to never anger the house again. They would be its good tenants, its loving family. They would obey its silent, unspoken rules. But the rules were cruel. The house wanted them all to itself. It began to isolate them. It would lock a bedroom door from the outside, trapping a family member within. It would change the layout of the rooms, a labyrinth of familiar places that led to a dead end. They were all alone, even when they were together. The house began to communicate with them, not through sounds, but through sensations. Lily, who had a special bond with the house, could feel its emotions. It would make her feel warm and safe when it was happy, a gentle, protective embrace. It would make her feel a cold, crushing dread when it was angry. She began to draw pictures of the house, a series of dark, terrifying images of a house with wide, gaping mouths for windows and a long, serpentine tongue for a front door. Sarah, her mother, was horrified. Ethan, the quiet observer, saw the house for what it was. It was a parasite. It was feeding on their fear, their love, their life. It was a living being that had been dormant for a century, and their presence had awakened it. It was draining their energy, their hope, their very souls. He felt himself growing weaker, his mind a fog of exhaustion and fear. David, the man of logic, finally broke. He had been trying to find a rational explanation for it all. A wiring issue, a gas leak, a psychological phenomenon. But one night he was in the kitchen and he saw it. The floorboards, old and rotting, began to lift and fall, a slow, rhythmic motion. The house was breathing. He fell to his knees, his hands covering his eyes, his body shaking. He had no more logic, he had no more answers. There was only the house. The house began its final stage. It wanted to consume them. It wanted to make them a part of its very being. One night, the family was huddled together in the living room, a small island of humanity in a vast, sentient sea. The breathing was a roar now, a deafening sound that shook the very foundations of the house. The walls began to ripple, the wallpaper peeling away to reveal a raw, pulsating substance underneath. The floorboards began to warp and twist, the wood groaning and cracking like a living skeleton. The furniture, once a part of their lives, was now a part of the house, its shape contorted and monstrous. The house had become a living, breathing monster, a carnivorous beast that wanted to devour them whole. They ran, a desperate, frantic flight to the front door, their only hope of escape. But the front door was gone. The wall where it had been was now a solid, pulsating mass of wood and drywall. They were trapped. They were in the belly of the beast. The house began to feed. It consumed their fear, their despair, their love. It was a slow, methodical process, a terrible, agonizing end. They were absorbed, their bodies and souls becoming a part of the house, a new piece of its living, breathing, monstrous whole. The house was now a perfect home. It had a family to feed it, a family that would be a part of it forever. Its breathing was a slow, contented sigh. It was a living tomb, a monument to a forgotten family and a terrible, insatiable hunger. It was waiting for a new family, a new hope to consume. And the house breathed, a low, rhythmic rumble that shook the very foundations of the earth. It was a hungry, patient beast, and it was waiting. The town of Havenwood was a place forgotten by time, a sleepy little hamlet where gossip was the only news, and the library was the most exciting landmark. Arthur Finch, the town librarian, found a quiet comfort in its predictability. He was a man who preferred the company of dusty tomes to people, and the library, with its scent of aged paper and wood polish, was his sanctuary. For 15 years he had lived a life of tranquil routine, a life filled with cataloging, shelving, and the peaceful, solitary echo of a silent reading room. His tranquility was shattered by a flood, not a biblical deluge, but a burst pipe in the library's basement. A slow, methodical trickle that went unnoticed for days. It ruined a small collection of old periodicals, but in doing so it revealed a hidden, false wall behind a stack of rotted shelves. Behind it was a single, heavy oak door with no handle, only a rusted brass plaque that read, "The Unclaimed Archives." The town mayor, an irritable man named Henderson who believed all books should be digital, instructed Arthur to clear the room out for storage. Arthur, however, was a curator at heart. He saw the archives as a treasure, not a chore. The room was a time capsule, a musty, forgotten space filled with a century of forgotten junk. But in the center of the room, on a lone, petrified wooden table, sat a collection of books unlike any he had ever seen. There were 7 of them, each bound in a rough, dry material that felt like old, sun-bleached skin. They were uniform in size and shape, with no titles on their spines, no author's name on their covers. They were just plain, featureless volumes, their pages a creamy, unblemished white. When he reached out to touch them, he felt a strange, subtle hum, a low, barely there vibration that seemed to resonate in the very bones of his hand. It wasn't a sound but a feeling, a deep, unsettling thrum. He dismissed it as a trick of his mind, an echo of the old building's slow decay. He started with the first book. He brought it upstairs to his desk, placing it under the warm light of his lamp. The cover was devoid of any markings, and when he opened it, the pages were completely blank. There was no text, no illustrations, nothing. He felt a pang of disappointment. He had expected to find a hidden manuscript or a long-lost diary, something that would fill in the blank spaces of the town's history. He sighed and put the book back, a heavy weight in his hands. That night he started a simple chore, filing the new patron cards. He had been doing this for 15 years. It was a muscle memory, but he couldn't remember how to do it. The process, the steps, the small specific details, it was all gone. A deep, cold fear settled in his gut. The next morning, the hum was stronger. It was a constant presence now, a low thrum that followed him through the library. He tried to ignore it, to blame it on a faulty circuit in the old building. But he couldn't ignore the blanks. He couldn't remember a book title he had read just last week. He couldn't remember the color of the mayor's hair. He couldn't even remember the exact year he had been hired. He felt a deep, chilling sense of loss. He went back to the unclaimed archives. The 7 books were sitting on the table, their quiet presence a menacing weight in the room. He picked up the first book he had touched. He opened it, and as his eyes fell on the blank page, a memory flashed into his mind. A vivid, crystal-clear moment from his childhood. His mother's voice singing a lullaby, her gentle touch on his forehead. It was so real, so tangible, it brought tears to his eyes. But as the moment faded, he felt a hollowness in his chest. A deep, aching void where the memory had been. He tried to remember the lullaby, but the words were gone. He tried to recall his mother's face, but it was a blank, faceless portrait in his mind. The books were not just blank, they were consuming. A terrible, dawning horror settled over him. He felt the books pulling on him, a silent, invisible suction that was trying to draw his very mind from his skull. They were feeding on his memories. The stronger the memory, the better the meal. The hum was not a sound. It was the sound of them digesting his past, a low, contented thrum. He began to notice other changes. The patrons who came in seemed different. Their conversations were disjointed. They would ask for books they had just returned. They would greet him like a stranger, even the ones who had been coming to the library for decades. He looked at the library's logbook. 100 years ago, there was an entry that detailed a similar series of events. It spoke of a great forgetting, a period when the town seemed to lose its collective memory of a tragic event. The entries were scrawled in a frantic hand, and the final one was a desperate warning. They are here. They are eating us. The entry ended abruptly. The next page was filled with a different, calm handwriting, a new librarian who had just taken the job. The previous librarian had simply disappeared. a memory wiped clean from the town's mind. Arthur realized the truth. The books were not just books. They were a hive mind, a parasitic consciousness that had been lying dormant for a century. They fed on human memories, and when they were full, they would retreat, leaving behind a collective amnesia. They were sentient. They were a living, breathing entity, a collective intelligence made of paper and silence. He couldn't let it happen again. He had to destroy them. He went to the basement, his mind a whirlwind of fear and purpose. He found an old gasoline can and a box of matches. He would burn the books, burn the unclaimed archives, burn the whole library to the ground if he had to. As he approached the books, the hum became a roar, a deafening frequency that rattled his teeth and made his vision blur. The books themselves began to move, their covers snapping open and shut like hungry mouths. Their pages rustled in a dry, papery whisper, a sound that was a parody of human speech. They began to project his forgotten memories back at him, distorted and terrifying. He saw his mother's face again, but her eyes were blank, her mouth a wide, black, silent scream. He saw his first love, but she was a hollow, empty shell, a ghost made of his lost past. They were taunting him, trying to break him, to make him give up his most precious memories, a final gourmet meal. He fought through the terror, his mind a battlefield of fragmented thoughts and horrifying visions. He knew their weakness. They were a hive mind. He had to disrupt their connection, their collective consciousness. He ran back upstairs, his heart pounding, his body a trembling wreck. He went to the library's old sound system, a relic he had kept for emergency announcements. He knew a few things about sound frequencies. He knew the right frequency, the right tone, could disrupt a satellite signal. He reasoned it could also disrupt a hive mind. He set the speakers up around the unclaimed archives, a ring of speakers facing the books. He had a custom-made audio device he had built as a hobby, a device that could produce a pure, high-pitched shriek. It was an ultrasonic device, an ear-piercing sound that was almost beyond the range of human hearing. He had to use it. It was his only chance. He turned the device on. A high-pitched, unbearable shriek ripped through the air, a sound so pure, so sharp it felt like a knife in his brain. The books reacted instantly. The humming stopped, replaced by a terrible grinding sound, a sound of paper and wood being torn apart. The books began to convulse, their covers snapping open and shut at a frantic, impossible speed. A dark, oily substance began to leak from their spines, a black, viscous ichor that smelled of decay. The books were screaming. It was a silent scream, a horrifying visual cry of pain. The air grew thick with the residue of his forgotten memories, a swirling dust of fragmented faces and forgotten names. The books were being torn apart, their pages fluttering like dead butterflies, their covers cracking and breaking. The hum was gone. The books were dying. Arthur stood there, the high-pitched shriek a constant pain in his ears, his body shaking with a terrible, triumphant exhaustion. He had done it. He had defeated the memory eater. He had saved the town. The final book fell to the floor, its cover cracking in two. The humming stopped. The library was silent. He stumbled out of the archives, his body aching, his mind a fog. The library was the same, the town was the same. He looked at the logbook. The old entries about the great forgetting were gone. He looked at his own notes. They were all blank. He looked at his hand, the one that had held the books. It was a perfect blank slate. He couldn't remember the last few hours. He couldn't remember why his ears were ringing. He couldn't remember the name of his dog, the one he had owned for 10 years. A patron walked in, a woman he had known for decades. He looked at her and smiled, a friendly, confused smile. He knew her face, but he didn't know her name. He knew he had seen her before, but he didn't know where. He knew a part of his life was missing. He went back to the unclaimed archives. The books were gone. The table was gone. The room was empty, a blank space where a terrible thing had lived. He realized, with a cold, dawning horror, that he hadn't destroyed the memory eater. He had just become its vessel. The books were not gone. They had just consumed the last of his memories of them, making him the new librarian of the forgotten, the new curator of the hive mind. The forgetting had begun again. The next day, a new librarian would take his place. No one would remember him. His life, his history, his very being, would be wiped clean from the town's mind, leaving behind a clean, empty space for the memory eater to feed on. He was the final meal. He was the perfect silence.
आज के लिए फिलहाल इतना ही। आपकी तरह मैं भी मायूस हूँ, लेकिन उम्मीद पर दुनिया कायम है। दिल दुखा है लेकिन टूटा तो नहीं है, और उम्मीद का दामन छूटा तो नहीं।